Hello everyone, the History of Pi channel is with you. Today, with the help of the Stolen History Forum, we will study another mysterious page of history. We will talk about the Great White Fleet and how it can be connected with the earthquake of 1908 year in Messina, Sicily. On a warm, cloudy morning of December 16, 1907, President Theodore Roosevelt stood on the deck of the presidential yacht Mayflower, standing in the waters off Hampton Roads, Virginia. The president and the crowds of onlookers gathered on the shore experienced a sense of pride and delight when 16 ships of the line of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, painted white, surrounded by auxiliary ships, sailed in a long majestic colony from Hampton Road to the open sea. Four squadrons of warships, called the Great White Fleet, were manned by 14,000 sailors and marines under the command of Rear Admiral Charles Evans. It was the first round-the-world cruise of a fleet of steam-powered steel battleships. The 43,000-mile circumnavigation of the world will include 20 port calls on 6 continents. The idea of sending a new battle fleet around the world was the brainchild of the energetic Teddy Roosevelt, a former colonel of the Courageous Horsemen. I've never heard of manly riders. I wonder what kind of legendary squad the colonels from which become presidents are. Brave riders. The 1st Regiment of the United States Volunteer Cavalry. The first of 3 volunteer cavalry detachments formed in 1898 year to participate in the Spanish-American War, and the only one that participated in battles. This detachment was also called the Tired Hodeikivudas after the first commander Leonard Wood, and as a sign that although the detachment was cavalry, the soldiers eventually fought on foot. First, a Secretary of War Russell Egler offered the command of the regiment to Theodore Roosevelt. However, Roosevelt had only a small military experience as an infantry officer of the New York National Guard, and gave up this position to a more experienced comrade. It was Colonel Leonard Wood, a doctor of the Military Sanitary Administration and a recipient of the Medal of Honor, who served in the regular cavalry. Roosevelt was promoted to lieutenant colonel and appointed deputy commander of the regiment. To participate in the war, Roosevelt resigned as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Roosevelt's personal qualities and his fame in the popular newspapers of the time were the leading factor that brought fame to the regiment. Roosevelt used his connections to ensure that the regiment was armed with Krug-Jorgensen carbines as regular cavalry, and not with single-shot Springfield Model 1873 rifles issued to the infantry. The regiment consisted of experienced ranch hands, Pawnee Indian scouts, Ivy League athletes, cowboys, police officers, and East Coast floor players. Many of the volunteers knew Roosevelt from his youth. Since there were more applicants than places in the detachment, many Roosevelt had to refuse, including the future popular writer Edgar Burroughs. Soon, the regiment became known as Roosevelt's Courageous Horsemen. It was a well-known name in 1898, which came from Buffalo Bill, who called his show The Wild West of Buffalo Bill and the Congress of Courageous Riders. For about a month, the volunteer unit underwent very rigorous training in Campood, Texas. After that, the regiment moved to Tampa, Florida, where loading for the Cuban Company was underway in the port. The regiment went to the theater of operations on the 14th of June, but due to a serious shortage of transport, almost all the horses were left in Tampa. The regiment landed in Cuba near Dyke on the 22nd of June. Due to the lack of horses, the regiment operated on foot. He then headed for Santiago de Cuba, and 2 days later took the Battle of Los Guachimos. Yielding to the enemy in numbers, the Americans were able to hold out in a firefight with the regular Spanish army. The brave horsemen in this battle suffered the heaviest losses in the entire Cuban Company. Why am I telling you all this? After all, this does not apply to the history of the Great White Fleet. I was surprised by the number of deaths in this regiment during the entire period of the Cuban Company. We are told about the heavy losses in the Battle of Guasimos, where an American regiment fought with superior forces of the Spanish army. When you hear such phrases, heavy losses, battles with superior enemy forces, a picture of hundreds of dead immediately looms in your head. But if you look at the certificate of the personnel of the Regiment of Courageous Horsemen, then this is what we see. 456 officers were recruited into the regiment, 994 soldiers, that is. In this regiment, there were only 2 soldiers per officer. It's kind of weird, but it's all a small thing. Just some elite regiment, recruited from the upper strata of American society. Now the most interesting part, lost during service. Let me remind you that the regiment participated in bloody battles with superior Spanish forces. 456 officers were recruited, only 2 people died in the battles. Probably, the officers had very good training, and therefore, 450 people masterfully dodged bullets and shrapnel. We look at the number of soldiers called up, 994 people. 21 people died in battle. I was very surprised by these figures. Some strange fighting took place in Cuba. They didn't seem to shoot at each other there at all. It doesn't fit in my head that only 2 out of 456 officers die in a battle with the use of rifled semi-automatic weapons. It feels like the Spaniards were shooting into the air and not at the enemy. Okay, let's leave the heroic battles for Cuba and return to the White Fleet. Having assumed the presidency after the assassination of President William McKinley, the hero of the Cuban Company, Theodore Roosevelt, convinces the White House that only through a strong navy can one project his power and prestige abroad. In general, Roosevelt sent a huge squadron around the world in order to show the power of the American military machine to the whole world. Theoretically, the Navy was not supposed to participate in any combat collisions, but simply by circumnavigating the globe, to scare everyone a little. This could be believed if it were not for a strange earthquake that occurred in Sicily on December 28, 1908, an earthquake with an instant magnitude of 7 points occurred in southern Italy. The cities of Messina and Reggi, Calabria, are almost completely destroyed. The earthquake almost leveled Messina. 90% of the structures in Messina were destroyed or irreparably damaged. About 75,000 people died. A young doctor who miraculously escaped said, "The deep silence was broken by an extraordinary noise, like the explosion of 1,000 bombs." Then the torrential rain began to pour. Then he heard an ominous whistling sound, which he compared to the hissing of 1,000 red-hot coals in water. All the survivors also heard a noise similar to that of a high-speed train in a tunnel. The large death toll in Messina is due to the fact that most of the people were sleeping when their houses began to collapse on them. Thousands of people were trapped under the rubble, suffering terrible injuries. Approximately 10 minutes after the earthquake, the sea on both sides of the strait suddenly left and has already returned in the form of a 12-meter tsunami. In Messina, the tsunami caused new destruction. Breaking out of the harbor, the waves overwhelmed the quarters of the city. Huge gas tanks caught fire and exploded in the northern part of the city. Fires broke out caused by broken gas pipes, which further intensified the chaos. This is what Messina looked like before the earthquake. It was a beautiful ancient city with the remains of star-shaped bastions. In this engraving, it looks simply amazing, like a stronghold of an ancient civilization. There was an earthquake, you say. And what does the armada of the US White Fleet have to do with it? The White Fleet doesn't seem to have anything to do with it, only just at that time, it was very close to Messina. The city is in almost the same condition as American cities after the fires of the 19th century. It looks like Boston or Chicago after a fire. Of course, it could just be a coincidence. Not far from Messina, huge squadrons of American ships pass by, and quite by chance, an earthquake occurred, and the city of Messina turned into ruins. Here's what Corbin Dulles dug up in official documents for this year. Of course, he did not find a document that indicates that Messina was bombed, but he found indirect evidence. Here is a link to the catalog of copyright records. Look at these strange records. What can they mean? Bombard Messina. Is this a link to a document about the bombing of Messina? Here's another weird thing. People behaved like crazy after the earthquake. They tore off their clothes, attacked the police. And that's not all. One can, of course, believe that one of the largest flotillas in the world took place near the city where the earthquake occurred. But it was quite by chance that there were Russian, English, and American squadrons here. There was an earthquake in one town, and for some reason, there are 3 squadrons of the largest world powers nearby. Did they share something here? Or did they agree on something? The first Russian ships of the Baltic Fleet came to Messina to help. Everyone imagines where the Baltic is located, and it was quite by chance that the ships of the Baltic Fleet on this day turned out to be in the Mediterranean Sea and stood off the coast of Sicily. These are the ships Tsarevich, Slava, Admiral Makarev, and Bogatyr. On the morning of December 29th, the Russian ships were at Messina. What our sailors saw on the shore, they hardly dreamed even in terrible dreams. Burning ruins, thousands of dead and crippled people. Whole blocks of residential buildings have developed like houses of cards. Looters were prowling around the city. Hungry people turned into animals and fought in warehouses over a piece of bread. And here again is this strange behavior of people. Why do people behave like animals? The earthquake happened only yesterday. Instead of saving their loved ones, they fight for the product. It would be understandable if all this was happening on a remote island and help would come in a month, but here only 1 day has passed, and people have already gone mad. Here's what interesting things can be learned from the newspapers of that period. Let's read it on the Old Age website. Here's what was unusual in a German newspaper. There are many foreigners among those who died under the ruins, especially Russians and Germans. Russians and Germans are writing about the death of a Russian warship, and for some reason, it seems strange to me. A small town in Sicily, and for some reason, a lot of dead Russians and Germans are writing about the death of a Russian warship. Russian sailors have been helping after the earthquake in Messina, but I have never seen any mention of a sunken Russian warship. Another newspaper writes that the British and Russian military vessels standing in front of Messina landed their crews on the shore to help the victims. For some reason, the ships standing in front of Messina are written, and not those that sailed to Messina. Here is the news from the 5th of January. There is such a hunger strike among the survivors that they are robbing government trains with food supplies for fear of starving to death. The police and troops, despite martial law, are powerless to cope with looters looting ruins and committing outrage over corpses. Looters are not even afraid of the death penalty. And here's the most interesting thing. Looters disguising themselves with soldiers commit horrors. The troops have to wage a uniform war with them. It is interesting to know the uniform of the soldiers of whose army the looters disguised themselves, and why regular units could hardly cope with them. Robber gangs are gathering from all over Sicily. They sneak into the city at night and engage in a formal battle with the soldiers. I am most surprised by the description of the Italian looters. They not only enter the city in an organized manner, but also change into military uniforms and engage in battles with the troops. Still, I wonder which country's uniform they changed into. And it's also very strange. Russian and German newspapers of the early 20th century pointed out that many Russians and Germans were killed during the earthquake, and a Russian warship also sank. Russian printed publications describe the feat of Russian sailors who helped the residents of Messina, but for some reason they do not remember the dead Russians and Germans. Also, the lost Russian warship is not mentioned anywhere. So what could have happened near Messina, where there were 3 squadrons of different countries? A Russian warship was lost, and during the earthquake, Russians and Germans were killed. They are also very puzzled by the insane behavior of people, as well as the maniacal persistence of Italian looters, who dress up in military uniforms and engage in battles with the army. So maybe it's not looters, but the remnants of someone's army? Probably, there was a division of the world in Messina. It seems that the Russians were on the side of the Italian government, because, even according to official data, Russia and Italy have established friendly relations in these years. And in October 1909 year, Nicholas II arrived in Italy. Now let's think theoretically. Could the Americans, for some political or other reasons, destroy the city of Messina, using only the types of weapons of the 20th century known to us? Of course they could. To do this, we will consider the tragedy that occurred in the port city of Halifax. On the 6th of December 1917 year, the auxiliary transport Mont Blanc, carrying 2,300 tons of dry and liquid picrilic acid, 200 tons of TNT, 10 tons of pyroxylin, and 35 tons of benzene in barrels, began to enter the port of Halifax. At the same time, the steamship Imu, which belonged to Norway, was leaving the port. As the ships approached, both captains began to make risky maneuvers, which eventually led to the IMO ramming Mont Blanc starboard. As a result of the impact, several barrels containing benzene opened, and their contents spread over the transport. The captain of the steamer Emma backed up and managed to free his ship and safely leave. At the same time, when the two vessels were uncoupled, as a result of metal friction, a shower of sparks appeared, which ignited the benzene that spread over the Monwan. Knowing about the nature of the cargo on the ship, Captain Lemmy December gave the order to the crew to leave the ship. All crew members reached the shore safely, leaving the deadly cargo to itself. As a result, the burning transport began to drift towards the shore. A monstrous explosion occurred at 9 o'clock in the morning. In the town of Gruru, which was 30 miles from Halifax, the shock wave knocked out all the windows. In Halifax itself, 1,600 buildings were completely destroyed, and another 12,000 were severely damaged. At the same time, the northern part of the city, and the Richmond district, was almost completely wiped off the face of the earth. So if a ship full of explosives were blown up off the coast of Messina, then we would have a picture similar to the consequences of an earthquake. In the beginning, the blast wave destroyed the building, and then the tsunami created by the explosion would destroy the remaining ones. And no secret developments are needed. But I gave an example of how it would be possible to destroy a city at the beginning of the 20th century, using conventional types of explosives. But, at the end of the 18th century, there were already scientific papers describing the principles of creating artificial earthquakes. And it looks like the Great Lisbon earthquake was caused artificially, but this is a topic for a separate video. That's it. Watch my channel.